Hi, I'm Franklin Tesler from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I'm going to be talking about 3D sonography in the abdomen. I have two disclosures. The first is that my department has a research relationship with Philips Healthcare. And the second is that I promise that no transducers were harmed in the making of this presentation. The reason for the second disclosure will be evident shortly. I'm going to start off my presentation with an apology, which is unusual for me, but I'm apologizing for all the jargon in the title of my talk. We see jargon in every facet of our lives these days. It's impossible to escape it. But I felt that the use of some jargon in my topic title was warranted, and I'm going to explain that to you. The first jargon word or phrase that I used was derived from the noun mainstream, which dictionary.com defines as the principal or dominant course. Of course, if you looked at the title, you saw that I used the verb form of this, mainstreaming, which means to send into the principal or dominant course. What does this actually mean for ultrasound? Well, it's something I think we're all familiar with, especially if we've been practicing ultrasound for a while, and that's putting a technique into common use. If you've been practicing ultrasound for as long as I have, you may recognize the image on the left, which is an old black on white static image of an aorta that was taken in the early 1980s. At that time, static imaging was the mainstream and real-time imaging was not. But the clip on the right, which shows a gallbladder in real time, eventually became mainstream, and now clearly anybody would consider real-time imaging as part of mainstream ultrasound. So you may wonder, isn't 3D already there? Why am I bothering to talk about mainstreaming something that is already in the mainstream? Well, certainly if you look at 3D ultrasound and obstetrics, you'd conclude that it is in the mainstream. This is a Google image search from about 2 years ago for 3D ultrasound in OB. And you can see from the response I got, and this is one of many thousands of pages and images, that clearly 3D ultrasound has made it in obstetric sonography. The same is true to possibly a somewhat lesser extent in 3D ultrasound applications in gynecologic imaging, as in this coronal reconstruction of a uterus showing very clearly the endometrium and surrounding myometrium. In my practice at UAB, we do far less OB ultrasound than we used to. We do very little second and third trimester work, mostly first trimester, so we don't really use 3D there. We do less gynecologic imaging than we used to, and we are using 3D there. So to summarize, I think 3D really is in the mainstream in both OB and GYN sonography, but not in the abdomen. Why not? I think there are a couple of reasons for this. First is the potential lack of a killer app in the abdomen. That is, there's no application that's so obvious that everybody has to do it, as is true in OB and GYN. However, there are other reasons as well, and it's those reasons I want to delve into in the remainder of this presentation. The first issue is design of transducers. And the biggest problem for me has been the size and weight of the first generation of 3D transducers in ultrasound. Here's an image of one of our older 3D transducers, and you can tell, even though there's no scale on this image, that this is a fairly large transducer. In fact, after working with this for a day, you may think that you've been lifting weights. Now, lest you think that I'm being wimpy and saying, I don't want to lift a transducer like this and use it for a long time, this is a real ongoing issue for sonographers who scan all day long. And the SDMS has taken a lead in looking at the risks of ergonomic-related risks, including size of transducers and weight of transducers on sonographer work-related injuries. The second issue is the mechanical design of these transducers, and that's illustrated in this animation here. What these transducers are is really an incorporation of a mechanism that sweeps through a volume and acquires the 3D volume. But it takes time to do it because it's a mechanical process. Furthermore, the mechanism of the transducer is bathed in fluid. And you can see that because of that, the face of the transducer is not completely rigid as it is with most of the probes that we're used to using. And as I activate this clip, if you look carefully, I was pressing on this actually fairly lightly. You can see the face of the transducer deforming slightly with each press of my finger. And I promised I wasn't harming this transducer. Again, my second disclosure, it was working just as well after I finished this clip as it was before. These transducers, because they contain fluid and because they contain mechanical mechanisms, tend to be more fragile than other transducers. And over the years, we've dropped several of these. I won't say that I've ever dropped one, at least I won't admit to it, but they have been dropped in our lab, and the transducer housing will crack and the fluid leaks out, and it's very expensive to have these repaired. Because of the mechanism of these transducers, resolution is limited as well. Again, it's a mechanical process of sweeping the beam through a volume, and it takes time to do that, and because it's mechanical, there is some change in resolution because it's very, very difficult to create a mechanism that follows exactly the same path each time, and it also takes time to do each sweep. That doesn't mean that it's not possible with non-moving objects like this kidney to get decent 3D reconstructions. In the clip you see at the lower left, the reconstructed C-plane. Actually, the resolution is not bad, but in this case, it was possible to do this because the kidney wasn't moving during the acquisition. It's instructive to look at the parallels between CT and volumetric ultrasound over the years. This is an old article, as you see. It's from AJR, October 1979, by Federley et al., talking about actually not 3D, but more correctly, reformatted CT images. And you can see the acquisition plane on the top, axial, and then on the bottom, you see two orthogonal coronal and sagittal planes. And if you look at those images, you can see the stair-step effect, which shows that the resolution of those images was considerably less than that of the acquisition or axial plane. Compare that to what we have now. This is a coronal reconstruction from a CT of the abdomen, and it looks like the scan was acquired in this plane. Another way to say that is that this represents near isotropic imaging, where the resolution, the spatial resolution, is the same in all directions. So really what you're trying to do with any type of volumetric imaging, as shown in this animation, is to get an ideal volumetric data set where each element, they're called voxels for volume elements, are the same in each direction. So far that's been impossible to do with the older style transducers, but again that doesn't mean that in ideal situations we couldn't get good volumetric images with those probes. Here, for example, in a 5-year-old sequence is a 3D reconstruction of the aorta and IVC, and as I turn this volume around you can see that there is a dissection flap in the aorta and the SMA. This is looking at it from the opposite direction. But generally speaking, all other things being equal, the older types of probes had less resolution than we would like. They were certainly not isotropic. So the second jargon word or phrase that I used in my title is enabling technology. And my other source of truth, Wikipedia.com, defines that as an invention or innovation that can be applied to drive radical change in the capabilities of a user. The new iPhone 4S from Apple, for example, that you see in the image on the right, its enabling technology is the A5 dual-core processor that lets the iPhone do what it can do. The first enabling technology that I'm going to talk about here is fully electronic probes or transducers. Because of their construction being all electronic with no moving parts, they can be lighter, they acquire volumes faster, and they produce higher resolution images. Here's an example of one such probe that we have in our lab. And although it's not quite as small as I'd like it to be a little bit smaller than this, it's certainly a big improvement over the large, bulky, heavy mechanical probe I showed you earlier. And it has no moving parts in it. In this animation from Philips, you can see that the beam produced by this type of transducer, which they call a matrix array, is produced electronically. And because it's done electronically, it can be moved a lot more quickly than a beam that is swept mechanically. In order to show you the difference in speed between these two types of transducers, I immersed both of them in a water bath and then did volume acquisitions with each one using the same volume size. And that's going to be illustrated in the next slide. Mechanical on the left, electronic on the right. And when I hit the begin button, watch to see which one finishes first. Here goes. And you see the electronic one is finished far earlier than the mechanical one. It works that much more quickly because it's electronic and not mechanical. The second issue has to do with post-processing. And again, if you're old enough to remember the days of film, back when we used to read ultrasound on film, you know that the type of processing I'm talking about was the film processor. Those were not fun days. In those days, the sonographer would produce images, take them to the film processor, wait for them to be produced, bring them to you to look at, and if you needed more images taken, you'd go through the same cycle again. It was not a good way to do ultrasound. It worked, it was all we had, but definitely left a lot to be desired. Fortunately, by the mid-1990s, many labs were moving into the electronic arena, such as on this early workstation, where we were able to see for the first time both clips and static images brought to us as the sonographer acquired them. And to me, this was a revolution in reading ultrasound. I was able to, as I am now, often to have a near complete report by the time the sonographer brought the images to me to discuss. And I would look and say, discuss the case with them and decide if any more acquisitions needed to be done or if I needed to scan myself. But in many cases, I was done and ready to sign off the final report. That was a great change for me. It's again instructive to look at the effects of this technology comparing CT versus ultrasound in workflow as it regards post-processing. The first way to do it is using a fully dedicated workstation. We recognized that several years ago at UAB and set up a dedicated 3D lab, which is located in our outpatient clinic, and that's staffed by technologists who spend their entire day reconstructing images, mostly from CT, some from MR. Now, here's another view of one of the technologists working on a CT reconstruction. Now, it's certainly possible that these people could do ultrasound reconstructions as well, but they tend to come from the CT or MR world and are not really as familiar with ultrasound as sonographers and radiologists who do ultrasound are. So over the past few years in doing 3D ultrasound, I've been using an independent workstation that's shown here. And here's a picture from a few years ago of me working at this workstation, producing multiplanar reformats and producing volumetric shaded surface display images. That's what I would use. The problem is that it would take time to get the raw data to this workstation. I'd have to fire it up, go through the effort of creating the images I want, and then I'd be stuck. There was no easy way to get these images back into the patient's study along with the originally acquired images. The second way of post-processing volumetric data sets is on the ultrasound machine itself. And again, here's the CT parallel. This is a picture of one of our CT technologists working at the CT console. Typically, we do multiplanar reformatting on all our scans. usually at least coronal, sometimes coronal and sagittal. And those are done automatically by the scanner. We do them all the time, so it's part of our workflow. However, if we want to do some non-standard reformats, we can call the CT technologist who sits at the workstation and produces multiplanar reformats or volumetric images as needed. The corollary of that in ultrasound is shown here. That's the ultrasound machine on the left, and at the top you see a shot of the work page, and you'll notice in the middle there's a button called QLab. QLab is Philips software for doing analysis, including slicing and dicing volume data sets and producing shaded surface displays. If you hit that button, what you see on top is this display, and you can then interact with QLab to get whatever you want. And this is how it looks in actual practice. This is me manipulating a volumetric data set on the machine itself. Again, similar to the workflow that we sometimes use in CT. The trouble with doing it on the machine is that it's time-consuming and relatively inefficient. That is, when you're using the machine to process a 3D volume, you're not using it to scan another patient, and you're wasting time, and time is money. However, this workflow can still be used for what I call protocol scans, where like in CT, you know you always want to do the same type of post-processing every time, and you could do it efficiently. But for the type of scan where you have a volume and you just want to explore it and figure out what structure is connected to what structure and figure out what's going on, it really doesn't work well. It's inefficient. So the third way of doing this is on the PACS. And here's an example in the CT world of one of our PACS workstations. With one menu selection, I can fire up the post-processing software and do all the reconstructions I want and save them as part of the original acquisition. So the second enabling technology is Ultrasound PACS with integrated 3D, and we've had this at UAB for several months now. Here's a video of one of our workstations showing you the diagnostic monitor on this side and the 3D monitor that I'll show you a little bit more of in a moment on the other side. This monitor, which is the same that we use for all our diagnostic reads, is actually divided into two virtual monitors. It displays all our clips, our static images, and it also displays our 3D volumes. And here's what those look like. This is a shot of the left kidney, just a static image showing some complex cysts at the lower pole. And on the workstation, it's from a company called iMorgan, which is the vendor of our ultrasound PACS. The volumes look like that. And they look a little bit different from the way clips ordinarily do, and this mimics the way the volume was acquired. More importantly, if you look carefully here, you can see on this workstation, some of these acquisitions have a little box next to them. And I'm going to magnify that up for you. That box has 3D in it, and if I click on 3D, what happens is that QLab opens up on this monitor here on the left. I can then use QLab just as I would on the ultrasound machine, but in this case I'm not wasting time on the machine. I'm doing it on the PACS workstation that I would also be using to read my regular studies. And I can do all the manipulations I want. When the time comes to export the images, I click on this button down here, and I get this dialog box which lets me export whether it's a volume shaded surface display volume I've created or a multiplanar reformatted image or what have you. That gets exported to the PACS and is then visible on the iMorgan workstation just as if it had been acquired and post-processed on the ultrasound machine itself. And this ability to do this post-processing on the PACS workstation has really been a major change for us. It enables me to use volumes much more frequently than I could before because there's a lot less work to do to actually get the volume ready to post-process, and once I've created the post-processed images, it's easy to get them back to the PACS. So all I do is do export to PACS and save, and it's there. The third issue is a little bit different from the others, and that relates to equipment availability. And if you look at a timeline in ultrasound technology from 1975 through 2012, you look at real time sometime in the 70s, endovaginal ultrasound in the early to mid 1980s, color Doppler in the late 80s, and then 3D or volume imaging in the earlier part of the last decade. There's something similar with all these advances, and I think color Doppler really exemplifies that well. This image that I found online is a shot of an ad for the first color Doppler ultrasound machine from a company called Quantum. And you can see how they were trying to market this. They called it angiodynography, let you see blood flow for the first time. It really was a great change in the way we looked at blood vessels and looked at flow in solid tumors and so on. The trouble is, most labs didn't have a lot of these machines. Even when they were available from other vendors, as they ultimately were, you often ran into a situation where you wanted to examine somebody with the color Doppler machine, but you didn't know where it is. So you'd yell, "Where's the color machine?" And typically it would be in another room or somewhere where you couldn't use it on that patient at that time, and you would just forego doing the color. In rare cases, you might make the patient wait or bring the machine from somewhere else, but it was difficult to do. But eventually, color Doppler ultrasound became ubiquitous, and we got to a point where every machine had color. We're not there yet with 3D. We have 5 inpatient scanning rooms at UAB, shown here. Unfortunately, we only have, despite having lots of transducers of different types, we only have one of these 3D transducers and only one machine it works on. And Murphy's Law being what it is, guaranteed that most of the time when I want to do a 3D acquisition on a patient, the machine or the transducer is in use somewhere else. And then you have to go through the same thought process that we used to with color Doppler and decide, do I want to wait or do I forego it? And most often for practical purposes, we forego it. So what's the solution to that? Unfortunately, it's not as simple as an enabling technology. The solution is really this. And I'm going to paraphrase a line from one of my favorite James Bond movies, Goldfinger, where James Bond is lying bound to a table and about to be sliced in half by a laser beam, and Aura Goldfinger, in response to James Bond's question, "Do you expect me to talk?" says, "No, Mr. Bond, in this case, I expect you to buy." And really the only solution to this is going to be acquiring additional equipment that can do 3D with the solid state matrix array transducers, and that eventually will happen. We're not there yet. Like many labs, we have a refresh cycle that runs every few years, so we may upgrade a machine or two every few years, but eventually we will get there. So what do you do in the meantime? Well, there are 3 types of workflow you can use in 3D. One is to scan in conventional 2D to get what I call the lay of the land and see what's going on with the patient. And you can tell fairly quickly if it's going to be normal or near normal. And in most cases, you can get by with just 2D acquisition. If you have a lot of 3D equipment, you can use 3D, but you don't really need it for many cases. If it's abnormal but straightforward, say gallstones or hydronephrosis, again, in most cases, 2D plus or minus 3D will suffice. But if it's an abnormal, complex case where you really want to acquire a volume so you can sit down later and interrogate that volume to decide what's going on, 3D is very helpful, along with the basic 2D. Again, that doesn't mean that you can't, if you have the available equipment, use 2D or rather 3D in other ways. For example, you can acquire a 3D volume of a kidney, as shown here, and slice it very quickly to duplicate the images that you get during a conventional 2D acquisition and do it more quickly. You can do the same thing as shown here with the gallbladder, again taking the single acquisition and then slicing it in multiple parallel planes, or even as in the second use case I just showed with a relatively straightforward abnormal case of a liver cyst, just take the volume and then slice it in multiple ways. But I think that 3D, especially in the area where it's limited in availability, is best reserved for more complex cases, as This was actually part of a much more complex case, but showing some clot in the IVC in two planes. In any example where you want to, again, acquire a volume and then interrogate it later offline on the PACS, 3D, I think, is the prime use. Again, this is most useful in instances where 3D isn't ubiquitous in your department. So the use case we're employing most often is this third example, abnormal complex cases where you want to acquire a volume and then interact with it later, where you do 2D and 3D imaging. The other two use cases, normal or near normal or abnormal straightforward, certainly can be useful. It can be useful to use 3D in those, but if the equipment isn't as available as you'd like, then I would reserve it, as we are in our lab, for the more abnormal complex cases. Over time, however, the new technology that enables the further application of 3D in the abdomen, just as it did with color and as with endovaginal sonography in real time before, it'll become more available and eventually will be available on all or most machines in our lab and many other labs, and that will drive further applications of 3D sonography in the abdomen. Thanks very much for your attention.